A rainy encounter. The relentless rain poured down on New York City, turning the bustling streets into a chaotic sea of umbrellas and reflections. The once familiar sounds of honking horns and chattering pedestrians seemed muted as the droplets splattered against the pavement, creating a shimmering, almost surreal scene. Alexander Grayson, CEO of one of the city's largest financial corporations, stared out of his sleek black sedan, barely registering the downpour. His mind was preoccupied with the meeting ahead, a high-stakes presentation that could define the future of his company. As the CEO of Grayson Enterprises, Alexander's life had become a series of calculated moves, carefully constructed strategies, and meticulous plans. He had spent years building his empire from the ground up, climbing the corporate ladder with precision and dedication. Emotion had no place in his world, only results. Success was the measure by which he defined his worth, and he was relentless in his pursuit of it. But today, something unexpected would disrupt his otherwise carefully controlled life. Alexander's eyes narrowed as the rain pelted against his windshield, each droplet a tiny explosion upon impact. The traffic light ahead flickered from red to green, signaling him to move forward. He reached to accelerate, but as he glanced briefly in his rearview mirror, something caught his attention, a figure standing alone at the corner of the sidewalk. It was a woman, her face obscured by the rain-soaked strands of her hair, but Alexander could see enough to recognize the despair in her posture. She stood under the shelter of a small awning, her arms wrapped tightly around a bundle, her small child struggling to shield him from the downpour. The woman was drenched, her old coat clinging to her thin frame, the cold visible in the way she shivered even from a distance. Her eyes, though filled with exhaustion, were determined, scanning the passing crowd for a sign of mercy. In her hand, she clutched a small cardboard sign, its uneven letters begging for help. Alexander's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than he intended, a distant feeling stirring in his chest. It was something he had long forgotten to recognize: compassion. Or perhaps it was empathy, the kind of raw, human response that made him squirm in discomfort. He quickly dismissed the thought. There was no time for feelings, not today, not now. His finger hovered over the steering wheel, and for a brief moment, his mind was consumed by the urgency of his upcoming presentation. His reputation, his legacy, it all hinged on this moment. But as the car idled at the traffic light, he couldn't shake the image of the woman and her baby from his mind. The image of her helplessness gnawed at him, pulling at something deep within him. Perhaps it was the reminder of his own childhood, one filled with scarcity and hardship before he built his fortune. Or maybe it was something else altogether, an unexplainable urge to help, to do something in a world where he had long since distanced himself from the pain of others. The light turned green. He exhaled sharply, pushing the thoughts away. Yet, without thinking, his hand moved toward the button to roll down his window. The sound of the wind whooshing in and the rain pelting against the car's metal frame seemed distant as he watched her, his decision already made. He leaned out, his voice cutting through the rain as he gestured for her to come closer. "Hey, come here," he called, surprised by the firmness of his own tone. The woman hesitated, her eyes flickering between the car and the street, uncertain and cautious. Alexander's hand instinctively moved to the door, and before he knew it, he had unlocked it, flinging it open for her. "Get in," he said, this time with a gentleness that was almost foreign to him. "It's freezing out here." The woman's eyes widened in surprise, her initial reluctance quickly giving way to a sense of need. Her gaze flicked between the warmth of the car and the wet streets that seemed to stretch endlessly before her. Her baby, still tightly wrapped in her arms, let out a soft cry, the sound pulling at her heart. With trembling hands, she adjusted her grip on her child and stepped toward the car. For a moment, Alexander thought she might refuse. After all, the gesture was strange, and to accept help from a stranger in a city as large and cold as New York felt like an impossible leap of faith. But the woman, despite her hesitation, moved toward him, her wet boots splashing against the puddles. She opened the back door slowly, her eyes wary, yet filled with a quiet desperation. Alexander watched her carefully, noting how the rain seemed to hang in the air around her, the smell of wet fabric and damp skin mixing with the scent of gasoline and exhaust. She finally settled into the back seat, her small child wrapped protectively in her arms. Her coat was drenched, and her hands shook from the cold. As the car pulled away from the curve, the city's skyline blurred in the distance, the towering buildings swallowed by the misty rain. The heater in the car hummed softly, attempting to cut through the chill that clung to both of them. Alexander adjusted the temperature, his eyes glancing at the woman in the rearview mirror. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice raspy from the cold. I didn't know what else to do." Alexander nodded but didn't respond immediately. His mind was still focused on the meeting ahead, the business that had to be done. But a strange silence filled the car. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable, but it was unfamiliar. He wasn't used to this kind of interaction, especially not with someone like her. After a few minutes, Alexander decided to break the silence. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Grace," she replied faintly, glancing down at her child, who was nestled in her arms. "This is Lucy." Alexander nodded in acknowledgement, but no further questions came. The silence between them grew comfortable, almost soothing in its simplicity. Grace, for her part, was still processing the fact that she was sitting in the back of a luxury car, a far cry from the dirty streets she had grown accustomed to. She was still adjusting to the warmth that enveloped her, trying to keep herself together despite the overwhelming kindness from this stranger. "Where are you headed?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure why she even asked. Perhaps it was simply a need to fill the silence, or perhaps she was curious about the man who had shown her kindness without any expectation in return. Alexander's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he responded. "Airport. I've got a flight to catch." Grace didn't ask why. She simply nodded, understanding that he had his own life to lead. Yet there was something about him. Something in the way he had spoken to her, in the way he had opened the door, that made her believe he wasn't like the others who ignored her on the street. She could see it in his eyes, the fleeting moment of empathy that passed between them before he retreated behind the walls of his professional persona. Minutes passed as they drove through the rain-drenched streets, the cityscape outside shifting as the weather turned harsher. Grace couldn't help but feel an odd sense of safety in the car. She wasn't used to feeling safe, especially not in a city that had been so unforgiving. Yet for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. The warmth of the car, the gentleness of Alexander's actions, it was like a brief escape from everything that had gone wrong in her life. As they approached the outskirts of the city, Alexander made an unexpected decision. Rather than heading straight to the airport, he turned the wheel toward his mansion, a sprawling estate tucked away in the affluent part of the city. Grace's heart skipped a beat as she looked out the window, the grandeur of the house coming into view. "I'm going to take you somewhere," Alexander said, his voice steady but distant. "You'll be safe there." Grace didn't argue. She had no idea what kind of place he was talking about, but the uncertainty of the moment made her feel powerless. All she had left to cling to was the strange hope that perhaps, just for tonight, she could find some comfort. The mansion loomed before them, a cold, imposing structure that seemed to tower over everything around it. It felt surreal to Grace, as if she had somehow stumbled into a different world, one that was completely out of reach. When the car finally stopped in front of the house, Alexander got out first, moving to open the back door for Grace. She hesitated, unsure of what to expect. But in that moment, she saw something in his eyes, a kind of uncertainty, as though he too were unsure of what was happening. "You can stay here until I get back," Alexander said quietly, holding out a small silver key toward her. Grace took the key with trembling hands, almost unable to believe what was happening. It was more than she had ever imagined. A night in a warm, safe place, away from the cold streets that had defined her life for so long. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice cracking with emotion. But Alexander didn't respond. He simply nodded, his face unreadable. As he walked away toward his car, Grace stood frozen for a moment, the key still in her hand. She didn't know how to process the gesture, how to understand the kindness that had been extended to her so freely, so unexpectedly. The door to the mansion closed behind her as she stepped inside, the warmth enveloping her like a gentle embrace. The mansion's embrace. The door to the mansion swung shut behind Grace with a soft thud, and for a moment she stood still, taking in the overwhelming silence. The vast entryway stretched before her, a grand hall with high ceilings, polished marble floors that reflected the soft glow of crystal chandeliers overhead. The walls were adorned with art pieces that could only have come from some of the finest galleries in the world, and the air was scented with an indefinable fragrance, clean and pristine. For a moment, it felt like she had stepped into a dream, one she could never afford to wake up from. Grace stood just inside the doorway, her wet clothes clinging to her skin, feeling out of place in a world so foreign to her. The warmth from the house seemed to seep into her bones, but it didn't quite reach the part of her heart that was still guarded and hesitant. The key she held in her trembling hands was a symbol of something she had never dared to expect: refuge. For the first time in what felt like years, she wasn't in survival mode. She wasn't worried about where to find food or where she and Lucy would sleep. For just a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, as if the suffocating weight of her life had been lifted. The storm raged outside, but inside, everything was calm. Grace glanced around the hallway, her gaze flicking nervously to the grand staircase that led up to the second floor. She could hardly wrap her mind around the magnitude of what was happening. She, a homeless woman with nothing but the clothes on her back and the child in her arms, standing in a mansion that was more like a palace. The heavy rain still beat against the windows, but here, in this space, she felt sheltered. Lucy, her daughter, stirred in her arms, a soft cry escaping her lips. Grace looked down at her precious child, whose small face was scrunched in discomfort, the chill of the rain still lingering on her skin. The warmth of the house seemed to soothe the baby, but Grace knew that she needed to settle her daughter down, to give her the comfort she deserved after such a traumatic day. She felt her heart swell as she cradled Lucy against her chest, silently vowing that no matter what happened, she would do everything in her power to protect this little life. With a sigh, Grace made her way further into the mansion. The soft carpet beneath her feet muffled the sound of her footsteps, and she walked slowly, almost reverently, through the living room. It was everything she had seen in magazines and on television, a place so lavish that it felt like a movie set. The furniture was pristine, the walls lined with bookshelves that stretched all the way to the ceiling. A grand piano sat in one corner, its polished surface reflecting the soft light. She couldn't even imagine what kind of life could exist here, a life that seemed so far removed from hers. But it wasn't just the opulence that stunned her. It was the strange, almost otherworldly feeling that came with stepping into this space. For someone who had spent so much of her life on the streets, someone who had learned to live in constant fear and uncertainty, it felt as though she was living in someone else's dream. How had she ended up here? What twist of fate had brought her to this moment? The thought was dizzying. She walked across the living room to the large windows that framed the garden outside. The view was breathtaking, the sprawling lawn dotted with trees that were now drenched in rain, the delicate outlines of the flowers lost under the sheets of water falling from the sky. She pressed her palm against the glass, her breath fogging up the surface for a moment as she tried to make sense of everything. Her fingers trembled as she wiped away the mist, staring out into the garden as the night deepened, the rain showing no sign of letting up. Grace's mind drifted back to her life on the streets. The days spent scrounging for food, the nights curled up in alleys or bus stops, always fearful of the next threat. She'd learned to survive, to shut out her feelings and focus only on what was necessary. Every day was a battle. But somehow, she had managed to keep going. Her love for Lucy had driven her to endure everything. It had been a struggle to protect her daughter from the world, but Grace had always found a way to keep her safe. Now, standing in this mansion, she felt like a different person. The heat from the house seeped into her cold bones, but it couldn't warm the fear that still gripped her heart. The fear of the unknown. The fear of what might happen when the kindness she had received was gone. This mansion was beautiful, but it was also a reminder of everything she didn't have. Still, she knew she couldn't think that way. Not tonight. Not when Lucy needed her. Turning away from the window, Grace looked around again. The spaciousness of the room overwhelmed her senses. She needed to find a place to rest, to give Lucy the comfort she deserved after the harshness of the day. She spotted a door at the far end of the room, leading to a hallway that seemed to open into another part of the house. As she moved down the hallway, she noticed a small study on her left, the door slightly ajar. Inside, the faint smell of tobacco lingered in the air, and there were shelves filled with books, each one carefully arranged as though the room had never been touched. Grace hesitated, wondering if she should go inside. But something about the room made her feel like she was trespassing, so she moved past it and continued toward the other rooms of the house. At the end of the hall, she found a guest room, large and inviting. The bed was massive, draped in a thick comforter that looked impossibly soft. For a moment, she simply stood in the doorway, unsure of what to do. She could hear Lucy softly cooing in her arms, still wrapped in the old, damp coat she had been wearing all day. Grace felt a pang of guilt, wondering if she had let her daughter down by not being able to offer her better. She shook the thought away. Tonight, that would change. Grace carefully laid Lucy down on the bed, making sure she was nestled comfortably beneath the blankets. The warmth of the room and the softness of the mattress seemed to relax Lucy, who let out a contented sigh and closed her eyes, drifting into a peaceful sleep. Grace watched her for a moment, a wave of tenderness washing over her. For the first time in a long while, Grace felt the luxury of peace. She reached for the bathroom door, hoping to wash away the remnants of the long, difficult day. She needed to feel clean, to reset her mind and body. But as she opened the door, she gasped in disbelief. The bathroom was beyond anything she could have imagined. White marble covered the walls and floor, the glow of recessed lights adding a soft warmth to the space. The bathtub, an elegant freestanding fixture, sat in the center of the room, surrounded by plush towels and delicate glass jars of bath salts. The mirror above the sink was framed in gold, its surface flawless. Everything in the bathroom spoke of wealth and refinement, things she had never known in her life. For a moment, Grace felt completely out of place. But then, as she looked at her reflection in the mirror, she saw not just the woman who had endured so much, but also the woman who still had the strength to continue fighting. She was not a beggar. She was a mother, a protector. She could find peace in this space, even if just for a night. She filled the tub with warm water, taking her time, savoring the moment. The scent of lavender filled the air, calming her frazzled nerves. When the water was just right, she carefully undressed and stepped into the tub, allowing the heat to envelop her. Every muscle in her body relaxed as the warmth worked its magic, and for the first time in a long while, she let go. She didn't have to be strong, not tonight. She could simply be Grace, a woman who had survived against all odds. The water felt like a healing balm, washing away the years of hardship. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel something other than exhaustion. She felt alive, and she felt hope, a hope that had been buried beneath layers of pain and survival instincts for far too long. As she sank deeper into the warmth of the bath, her mind drifted, not to the past, but to the present. She had made it here, to this moment, to this haven. And in that moment, she knew that, no matter what the future held, she would always have the strength to keep going for Lucy, for herself. Tonight, she had found a small piece of peace, and it was enough. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside, Grace found a rare moment of calm, a quiet sanctuary where she could rest and rebuild herself, one breath at a time. A night to remember. The night stretched on, and Grace lay in the master bedroom, the soft sounds of the rain tapping against the windows like a soothing lullaby. Her thoughts seemed to wander in circles, as though the serenity of the house had momentarily erased the constant tension she had lived with for so long. For the first time in years, she wasn't worrying about where they would sleep next, or what dangers the streets might hold. Instead, she was nestled in a luxurious bed, surrounded by warmth and comfort, with Lucy beside her. Her daughter, her only source of light in the darkness of their previous life, was curled up next to her, soft breaths rising and falling in perfect rhythm. The feeling of Lucy's small body pressed against hers brought a deep sense of relief, something Grace hadn't realized she had been missing. It was more than just the physical presence of her child. It was the emotional connection, the grounding force that reminded her why she had to keep fighting. Lucy was the reason she kept going, the reason she had not given up despite everything life had thrown at her. As the night wore on, Grace's mind kept drifting back to the events of the day. Alexander Grayson, her savior in this strange, unfamiliar world, had done something so unexpected, so completely out of the ordinary, that it felt like the universe had momentarily paused to allow her a glimpse of something better. She had never known people like Alexander. In her life, she had learned to distrust anyone who offered help. It was always with strings attached. But Alexander had acted without hesitation. He had seen a desperate woman on the streets, a woman who was not asking for help, and without any reason other than a fleeting feeling, he had offered her shelter and safety. His gesture was more than just charity. It was a reminder of the human kindness that still existed, even in the cold, unforgiving world they lived in. Grace ran a hand through her damp hair, feeling the tension in her shoulders slowly ebbing away. She had spent so many years keeping her emotions locked down, a survival mechanism born from the harsh reality of her life on the streets. But tonight, she felt the walls she had so carefully constructed around herself begin to crack. There was no need to be guarded anymore. In this mansion, under the soft glow of chandeliers, surrounded by warmth and comfort, she could allow herself to feel. She glanced over at Lucy, her daughter's small face serene in her sleep. She marveled at the innocence in her features, a stark contrast to the chaos and hardship that had marked their lives. Lucy had never known stability. She had never known what it felt like to sleep in a warm bed, surrounded by safety and love. All Grace had ever wanted was to give her that. For a moment, Grace let herself imagine a life where Lucy could grow up free from fear. A life where she could go to school without wondering if they would have enough food to eat. A life where Grace didn't have to make impossible choices every single day. It was a life that seemed so distant, so out of reach. But tonight, in the quiet comfort of the mansion, it didn't feel completely impossible. Grace took a deep breath, pulling the covers tighter around her as the soft warmth of the bed enveloped her once again. She closed her eyes, allowing the serenity to take over, but her thoughts still drifted back to Alexander. She wondered about him, about the man who had made an extraordinary decision to help a stranger, to extend a hand when he could have easily ignored her. What kind of person was he? What had driven him to make such a choice? In all her years of struggling to survive, she had encountered people from all walks of life, some kind, others cruel, but never had she met someone like Alexander. It was hard to believe that someone who had everything, wealth, power, success, could see beyond his own world to recognize her need. She wasn't used to being treated like a human being, much less someone worthy of kindness. But there was something else she couldn't shake. Alexander's gesture had been more than just a random act of charity. She had seen it in his eyes, the fleeting moment of connection when he had first looked at her on the street. It was a brief flash of recognition, something that spoke to a deeper understanding, as if he saw beyond the surface. It wasn't just pity or sympathy. It was something more complex, something harder to define. Grace sighed softly, turning her gaze toward the large windows that overlooked the garden. The storm outside had subsided, but the city remained cloaked in darkness, the rain now nothing more than a faint drizzle. The world outside was quiet, and so was the house. For the first time in a long time, the silence was peaceful rather than suffocating. She let her eyes wander around the room, taking in the fine details of the luxurious surroundings. The room itself was like something from a fairy tale. An immense king-sized bed, a plush rug beneath her feet, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the rain-soaked garden. The walls were decorated with soft, muted colors, and the air felt heavy with the subtle scent of lavender. Everything in this room seemed carefully curated, meticulously chosen to create the perfect environment for rest and relaxation. And yet, despite the beauty of it all, Grace couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. She didn't belong here. This was a world she had never known, one that seemed as foreign as the moon. She had spent her life in the shadows, on the margins of society, and now she was thrust into the bright, blinding light of wealth and privilege. It felt like a dream she wasn't ready to wake up from, but it also felt like an illusion she might never fully trust. As she lay there, her mind began to wander again, but this time, her thoughts weren't on Alexander or the mansion. Instead, they drifted back to her past, the life she had before everything changed, before the tragic accident that had taken her parents and left her with nothing but pain and emptiness. Grace had once been like any other young woman, full of hope and ambition. She had been driven by the desire to make a difference in the world, to succeed, to rise above her circumstances. She had worked tirelessly to earn her place in medical school, determined to be the first in her family to graduate from college. She had big dreams, dreams that seemed so tangible at the time. But life, it seemed, had other plans. The day her parents died, everything changed. The world she had known, the world of love and support, of shared memories and dreams, crumbled in an instant. The phone call that brought the news of the accident had shattered her, and from that moment on, she had never been the same. The loss of her parents left a void in her life, one that no amount of money or success could fill. And then came Christopher, the man who had promised her the world and had, instead, taken everything from her. The betrayal had come in layers, the emotional manipulation, the financial theft, and finally, the cruelty that left her alone and pregnant with Lucy. Grace had learned to survive, but she had never fully healed from the wounds Christopher had inflicted upon her. She had spent years trying to rebuild herself, but the weight of those years had left her feeling broken, as though her spirit had been irreparably shattered. Now, as she lay in this luxurious bed, surrounded by warmth and comfort, Grace could still feel the remnants of that pain. She could still feel the sting of loss, the ache of betrayal, and the sorrow of everything that had been taken from her. But there was also something else, something that hadn't been there for years. Hope. Grace closed her eyes again, allowing the warmth of the bed to comfort her. It was still hard to believe that this was real, that she had found herself here, in this place of safety. She knew that tomorrow would come with its own set of challenges, that the future remained uncertain. But tonight, for just one night, she could rest. And for that, she was grateful. As the darkness of the room wrapped around her, Grace's thoughts drifted, and she finally allowed herself to sleep, a sleep without fear, without anxiety, without the heavy weight of survival. The storm outside had passed, but the storm within her heart would take longer to quiet. Yet, in the quiet embrace of the mansion, Grace had found something she hadn't thought possible: peace. A glimpse of the past. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of the mansion, casting a soft, golden hue across the room. Grace slowly awoke, the warmth of the bed wrapping around her like a protective cocoon. For a brief moment, she didn't remember where she was. Only the soft, steady rhythm of Lucy's breathing beside her reminded her. The little girl lay nestled in the covers, her face peaceful in sleep. Grace couldn't help but watch her for a moment, mesmerized by the sight of her daughter's innocence. For so long, Grace had carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, worrying about where they would sleep, what they would eat, and how to keep Lucy safe from the harsh realities of their life on the streets. But here, in this strange mansion, the burdens felt a little lighter, at least for the moment. The softness of the bed, the warmth of the room, the quiet peace that had descended over the house in the night. It all felt too good to be true. She shifted slightly, careful not to disturb Lucy, and sat up, her body stiff from the exhaustion of the previous days. Grace stretched, her muscles aching from the tension of years spent in survival mode. She had spent so long on edge, so long fighting to keep herself and Lucy safe, that she hadn't allowed herself the luxury of rest. But here, in this space, she could finally breathe. It wasn't the kind of peace that erases the past, but it was a small reprieve, a chance to gather strength before whatever lay ahead. As Grace gazed out the window, she could see the last remnants of the rain, the grass and flowers in the garden glistening under the soft morning light. It was a serene scene, one that felt almost surreal. Her mind wandered back to the night before, to the strange turn of events that had brought her here. Alexander Grayson, the man who had opened his mansion to a complete stranger, was still a mystery to her. She couldn't quite understand his motivations or why he had chosen to help her. Was it out of pity, compassion, or something deeper, something she couldn't yet grasp? The thoughts swirled in her mind, but Grace quickly pushed them aside. It wasn't time to dwell on questions she couldn't answer. Instead, she focused on the moment before her, the stillness of the room, the quiet of the mansion. For now, she could enjoy the luxury of peace, however fleeting it might be. Lucy stirred beside her, her small hands reaching out, as if searching for her mother. Grace smiled softly and gently pulled her into her arms, feeling the warmth of her body against her own. She whispered a quiet, "Good morning," and kissed the top of Lucy's head. The little girl blinked sleepily, her eyes slowly adjusting to the light. "Mama," Lucy mumbled, her voice still thick with sleep. "Yes, sweet girl," Grace replied, brushing a lock of hair from Lucy's face. "It's morning. How did you sleep?" Lucy nodded, a small smile spreading across her face. "Good," she said simply, her hand still clutching the edge of the blanket. Grace held her for a moment longer, savoring the simple joy of being able to care for her daughter without the constant worry of survival. It felt like a luxury, one that she hadn't realized she missed so much. She had spent so long trying to protect Lucy from the harshness of life, but in this moment, she realized that she had also been trying to protect herself from the pain of remembering everything that had been lost. After a few moments, Grace carefully set Lucy down on the bed and stood up, stretching her stiff limbs. She had no idea what the day would bring, but she knew that she had to face it. She couldn't afford to lose sight of the future, even if it seemed uncertain. As Grace stepped into the bathroom to freshen up, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. Her reflection was a stark contrast to the woman she had once been, the woman who had dreamt of a different life, a life full of promise and hope. But that woman seemed like someone from another time, another life. She had become someone else, someone who had learned to survive, to protect her daughter at all costs, no matter the personal cost. She had once been filled with ambition, the kind of ambition that led her to medical school. She had dreamt of becoming a doctor, of healing others, of making a difference in the world. She had been so sure of her path, so determined to build a future where she could provide for herself and her family. But life had a way of shattering even the best laid plans. Grace's eyes lingered on her reflection for a moment longer, the familiar ache of loss stirring in her chest. The memories came flooding back, memories of her parents, of her childhood before everything changed. She had grown up in a loving household, with parents who had worked hard to provide for her and her siblings. It wasn't a life of luxury, but it was a life filled with warmth, laughter, and love. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and that had always been enough. The accident that took her parents had been a cruel twist of fate. It had come out of nowhere, leaving Grace and her younger brother with nothing. No parents, no support system, no guidance. The grief had been overwhelming, a weight that pressed down on her chest every day. She had tried to move forward, to keep going for her brother's sake, but the world had changed overnight. She had to grow up quickly, taking on responsibilities she was never prepared for. She had thought about quitting medical school countless times. The demands of school, the pressure of working to support herself, and the emotional toll of losing her parents had been too much to bear. But she had pushed through, determined to honor the memory of her parents and finish what she had started. It had been hard, almost unbearably so, but she had managed to hold on, until she met Christopher. Christopher had been her escape, the man who had promised her a brighter future. He had been charming, kind, and understanding, a balm for the wounds left by her parents' death. But it hadn't taken long for the cracks in their relationship to show. The emotional manipulation, the gradual erosion of her trust, and the eventual betrayal had broken her in ways she hadn't known were possible. The financial destruction he had caused had left Grace with nothing. No savings, no security, and no way to continue her education. She had been forced to leave medical school behind, the dream of becoming a doctor slipping further away with each passing day. Instead, she had found herself in a desperate fight for survival, trying to make ends meet in any way she could. She had done things she wasn't proud of, things she had never imagined she would have to do just to survive. As Grace washed her face, the cold water jolted her back to the present. She could feel the weight of the past pressing on her, but she also knew that she couldn't let it define her. Not anymore. She had been given a chance to rest, to heal, to rebuild. And for the first time in a long time, she was going to take it. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the day ahead. Whatever it brought, she was ready to face it. She didn't know what Alexander's intentions were, or what the future held, but she knew one thing. She would protect Lucy, no matter what. And somehow, she would find a way to create a better future for both of them. As Grace stepped out of the bathroom, she found Lucy sitting up on the bed, looking around with wide eyes as if she, too, was still trying to process the strange new world they had entered. The little girl was already showing signs of the resilience that Grace had tried so hard to instill in her. There was a spark in Lucy's eyes that told Grace everything she needed to know. They would make it through this together. With a smile, Grace crossed the room and knelt beside her daughter, brushing the hair from her face. "How about we explore this place a little more?" she asked gently, her voice soft but filled with hope. Lucy nodded eagerly, a smile spreading across her face. The joy in her daughter's eyes made everything worth it. Every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of fear. For the first time in a long time, Grace allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future that was not defined by hardship. For now, she could let go of the past, even if just for a little while, and focus on what was before her, a new beginning, a new chance. And maybe, just maybe, the future wouldn't be as bleak as it had once seemed.